Hey, it's Dave Brown here, host of Now with Dave Brown on AMI. Check out this latest highlight from the show. Climate change and the climate crisis has once again been put into focus this year with disasters in Western Canada, all over Western Europe, the United States. You look for it, and there have been impacts of climate change to be seen everywhere. To look back on some of the biggest news stories of 2021, we're pleased to welcome back into the show Arno Kopecky from Vancouver. Arno is the author of the recently published book, The Environmentalist Dilemma, Promise and Peril in the Age of the Climate Crisis. Arno, thank you for making time to be with us again. We're very appreciative.
Good morning, Dave. It's great to be back on your show.
So the first time we spoke to you last summer, at the time we were talking about some of the International Panel on Climate Change report that was referred to as a red code for humanity. Have the events over the past year heightened that urgency?
I would say they have certainly borne out the warnings, yes. And I think the urgency is increasingly felt around the world, and certainly here in Canada. What can I say? I live in British Columbia, which I'm sure you and your viewers have been aware of what's going on this last fall and the summer before that. We had a sort of back-to-back trifecta of extreme climate impacted weather events, starting with the heat dome at the end of June that killed 600 people, followed by forest fires that led to the evacuation of 40,000 people in the interior of British Columbia and shut down travel and created a sort of a homegrown refugee crisis. And then, of course, literally the day after the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow, the day after that, the rain started to fall here on the south coast of British Columbia, and it went straight across the province and just destroyed our infrastructure. I think 16,000 people were evacuated because of that, and Vancouver was cut off from the rest of the Canada. Every one of the highways and railways connecting this city to the rest of the country was destroyed. And we are still at the tail end of the state of emergency, and gasoline is still being rationed in Vancouver, and we are still picking up the pieces. So, I live in Vancouver. It was visceral, it was real, and I think that shockwave has reverberated across the country and even made international news. Yeah.
You mentioned that those events took place just at the tail end of that COP26 conference, which, of course, had that huge focus on Glasgow and had that huge focus on the discussion. Do you think that even in the weeks following, the action has matched the rhetoric that a lot of politicians put forth for those few weeks?
It's so early. I guess the short answer is no, Dave. I actually probably part ways with many of my environmentalist peers. I take a lot of hope in the Glasgow meeting. I see it as the biggest diplomatic effort really in the history of humanity, maybe except for right after World War II. We have almost 200 countries coming together, thousands of scientists trying to get us off the greatest source of prosperity in human history. It is no easy task. It was never going to be enough. We are not accelerating decarbonization. We are not getting off oil and gas anywhere near fast enough. It is true. But I think that is partly, definitely politicians have a lot of responsibility. They are our leaders. We have elected them to lead us through crises. But I was talking to a friend recently, and he said something that really stuck with me. He said, you can only have good politicians if you have good citizens who care about policy and who care about current events and are informed about them. And I think that's truer than ever. I think my hope is that the electorate is galvanized by the recent, overwhelmingly unambiguous evidence that climate change is here and now and happening, and that we start to vote for the very leaders who can actually enact the policies that we need to get out of this crisis.
Yeah, we tend to get the governments that we deserve, right? If we engage ourselves, then those are the people that we get. So along those lines, one of the things that struck me after the 2019 election is that essentially 2/3 of the Canadian population was cool with the price of carbon. And I think even since then, we're seeing some of the rhetoric around carbon pricing going down. Was there a story this year or a proposal this year or an idea this year that caught your mind that might be sort of the next step or the next stage or the next policy that might resemble the way in which we've seen some of the increasing approval on things like pricing carbon?
I've been thinking about that. I wish I could say yes. I mean, I think it was striking in March of 2021 this year that within the same month, within a couple of weeks, Canada's Supreme Court ruled that the carbon price is legal. Of course, the four provinces led by conservatives across the country had tried to fight that and declare it unconstitutional. The Supreme Court said, no, it's constitutional. We can price carbon. The federal government can do so. Within a week or two of that ruling, the federal conservatives decided to strike a statement from their national convention acknowledging that climate change is real. Those two things happened back to back, and then again, as in 2019, in our 2021 election, conservatives lost once more. And again, the country overwhelmingly voted for parties that actually believe in climate change and want to do something about it. Looking forward to what's going to happen in 2022, there's no grand sweeping thing. I think we're in a sort of trench warfare. Unfortunately, I wish there were some radical proposals on the table. I'm really watching how are we going to lower emissions from the oil sands, the oil patch here in Canada. The federal government has said, we're not going to look at production as much as we're just going to look at emissions. So I don't know exactly how that's going to work. It is really a disappointing cop-out, because even if let's say they figure out some magical carbon capture scheme that has evaded them and the world so far, and they do lower emissions within the oil patch itself, that does nothing about the downstream emissions, which is to say the emissions that are created when you burn the oil and gas that have been extracted and refined, which accounts for about 70 or 80% of the overall emissions in oil and gas production. So that's a real issue. I wonder if they're going to take that on. Forestry is another thing. Canada was one of the countries that signed on to a pledge in Glasgow, to halt global deforestation. And so that's a very significant global pledge, and hopefully countries can unite around that. Again, the issue is that Canada doesn't really, our official position is that there is no deforestation in Canada because we replant every tree that we log. And that is true, but there's a big difference between a tree farm and original standing forest. And there's a lot of damage. Here in BC, we're still logging ancient original forest. These 1,000, 1,500-year-old trees they're still falling here. So those are some of the things I'm watching. Also, Canada has made a pledge to conserve or protect 25% of our land and ocean territory by 2025 and 30% by 2030. So that's a really big policy thing that I take a lot of hope in, and I think I hope there are some big announcements pending, because there are a lot of beautiful territories that could be, a lot of this is forest land that, if left unprotected, could be a key part in the fight against climate change. Sorry.
Arno, I don't mean to end this segment looking back and then doing on a negative note, because I like a lot of the things that you identified there as being areas of concern and things where we could frame some policy ideas. But you talked about how you're out in BC. I was actually in BC as well when some of those floods were hitting, and it was completely surreal to see that happening. I know earlier in the year, looking at some of those floods in Western Europe, particularly in Germany, I found to be quite striking. Just the speed with which the damage was done to places very similar to what we saw with some of the mudslides in British Columbia. Was there an environmental disaster, an environmental moment, or something that happened around the world that sort of made your the hair stand up on your arms this year as well, but beyond the one that you lived through while you were in BC?
That was really the one, I have to say, living in the heart of it, just the three back to back. I was really captured by, at the height of the wildfire season when the Mediterranean was burning so graphically. Also at that point, Russia's fires in Siberia, those fires were sending smoke up to the North Pole, which was the first time smoke has ever reached the North Pole. And the North Pole also set a temperature record of 38 degrees in June, I believe. So that there's something about the North Pole that is so iconographic that really captured me. And I suppose if I was to mention one other one, it was at the Gulf. There's a huge Gulf current that goes through the North Atlantic Ocean and really sets a lot of the weather cycles throughout the world, especially North America and Europe. And there's evidence that that is slowing down. That came in this year because of all the meltwater off of Greenland, off the Greenland ice sheet. So that cycle is slowing, and that is a huge, these things take hundreds, thousands of years to kick in, these cycles. And as that slows down, it's going to really drastically impact rain patterns and drought cycles throughout the world, really. And so those were two of the big weather events. If I can inject a note of positivity, Dave,
please.
I do want to say I think there is a silver lining in that as these things become real and visceral and just totally undeniable. I think we're at this really exciting moment where humanity and Canada is included, is starting to take note. And as we can't ignore these things, that we're living in this really actually exciting moment where action is starting to creep up to the level needed, because it's no longer just climate change isn't something that's happening in the North Pole or in the Marshall Islands. It's happening here and now. And so I see this as a very electric moment of possibility. And I do have a lot of hope that it will translate into action. I mean, we have in Stephen Guilbeault, we have an environment minister who was himself a really radical activist. And so I think he's going to be one of the very interesting people to watch and to see what he can do in this government. There are immense pressures on him from all sides. So that's one of the people I'm watching.
Arno, that's why I like having you as a guest on this show. I ask you a question soaked in pessimism and negativity, and you end on an optimistic note. I like that.
A little optimism.
Hey, Arno, you can even be optimistic early in the morning. That's another reason why I like you. Thanks for stopping by today. Great chatting with you again. Let's do it again in the new year.
Thanks, Dave. Can't wait.
That's Arno Kopecky. He is the author of the book, The Environmentalist's Dilemma, Promise and Peril in an Age of the Climate Crisis. And he spoke to us this morning from Vancouver, BC. Do you want to dive into more conversations like this? Watch Now with Dave Brown weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on AMI TV, or download the podcasts wherever you listen. Do you want to dive into more conversations like this? Watch Now with Dave Brown weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on AMI TV, or download the podcasts wherever you listen.